you don't have to sing on this song if you don't want to. If you like the idea, though, you can help me out. If you love your Uncle Sam, bring him home, bring him home. Support our boys in Vietnam. Bring him home, bring him home. It'll make our generals sad, I know. Bring him home, bring him home. They want to tangle with the foe. Bring him home, bring him home. Here is their big fallacy. Bring him home, bring him home. They don't have the right weaponry. Bring him home, bring him home. The world's got hunger and ignorance. Bring him home, bring him home. You can't beat that with bombs and guns. Bring him home, bring him home. So if you love your Uncle Sam, support our boys in Vietnam. Bring him home, bring him. Now I may be right, I may be wrong. Bring him home, bring him home. But I got a right to sing this song. Bring him home, bring him home. Now there's one thing I will confess. Bring him home, bring him home. I'm not really a pacifist. Bring him home, bring him home. If an army invaded this land of mine, bring him home, bring him home. You find me out on the firing line. Bring him home, bring him home. Even if they drop their planes to bomb, bring them home, bring them home. Oh, they brought helicopters and napalm. Bring them home, bring them home. So if you love your Uncle Sam, support our boys in Vietnam. Bring them home, bring them home. Yes, show these generals their fallacy. Bring them home. They don't have the right weaponry. Bring them home, bring them home. The world needs housing, food and schools. Bring them home, home, home. And learning a few universal rules. Bring them home, bring them home. So if you love your Uncle Sam, support our boys in Vietnam. Bring them home, bring them home. Well, now, you don't have to sing on this song if you don't want to.
Good evening, or good afternoon, or if you're on the other side of the world, good morning. I'm John McAuliffe of the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee and the Fund for Reconciliation and Development. This is somewhere about the 31st or 32nd webinar program we've done about the history of the anti-war movement from the perspective of those who were part of it. We're coming close to the end as we get to the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, and a bunch of us are going to be in Vietnam to be part of those observations. I'm going to turn this over to Terry Provance, who's also a member of VPCC, and he will start it off. Terry, go ahead.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, I'd like to welcome you to our program. I'm speaking to you from New York City, and it's a very good evening. And as John said, if you're in Europe, it's just past midnight, and we're glad you're not saying good night. If you're in Vietnam, where several of us will be in a couple of weeks to celebrate the end of the war after 50 years celebration, it is a good morning. It's 8 or 9 a.m. on Wednesday, the 26th. And if you're on the West Coast and in the western part of the United States, it's a good afternoon. Before we begin our discussion this evening, for which there is considerable anticipation, we want to take a few minutes to honor and remember two heroes who have passed away most recently. I'm referring to David Hartsoe, who died on Sunday morning, and Arnold Schechter. Arnold was involved in medical issues and helped us to learn a lot about dioxin. and David was a hero among heroes. John's going to say a few words about Arnold, and then Robert will say a few words about David. John's trying to find the picture photo of Arnold.
No, Robert should go ahead because I've got it lined up with David first and then Arnold. So, Robert.
Okay, well, David died this last weekend at age 84, almost 85. And this is probably his last of more than 150 times he was arrested. This picture that you see, he was arrested out at Travis Air Force Base in California with a blockade of, or trying to blockade the entrance to the Air Force Base where weapons for the genocide in Gaza were being sent. His civil disobedience actually started back in about 1960, where he was one of the sit-in demonstrators in Virginia. And he was, as I said, arrested over 150 times. He was a Quaker activist. And there's a wonderful book he wrote called Waging Peace, Global Adventures of an Anti-War, or of a Peace Activist. Anyway, many of us have known David over the years, and we actually featured him in our film, The Movement and the Madman. So,
thank you, Robert. John?
We go back to the other share. Okay, are you seeing Arnold now? Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Arnold Schechter is a person who was key in the early stages of work on Agent Orange dioxin, the legacy, one of the longest term and most destructive legacies of the US war in Vietnam and to some extent in Laos and Cambodia. Arnie was a doctor, graduate of University of Chicago. We'll put on the chat obituary about him, but it doesn't say much about what's relevant to him being here. He, at the beginning of his work on Agent Orange, we were in a major political battle to get acknowledgement of the problem and to get acknowledgement of US responsibility for the problem. As he deceased, he should have felt some feeling of accomplishment because the US government has now done substantial remediation work and was in the middle of it when everything got screwed up by the cutoff of aid programs all over the world, but hopefully it will be restored. At any rate, Arnold was a person of many strong traits and did not suffer fools kindly, but take a look at his obituary, and we'll probably put some more in the newsletter.
So Robert and John, thank you very much. Would all of you please join together in a few moments of silence to honor and remember them? Thank you very much. For the past 10 years, the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, which is composed of anti-war activists from the 60s and the 70s, have brought to you over 40 different activities, conferences, webinars, vigils, and presentations and workshops, all of which are recorded for you to go back to our website, vietnampeace.org, to see and for future generations. We're remembering the 50 years of the buildup of the war by the United States military in 1965 to the end of the war in 1975. And the programs that we've done have focused and looked at the Gulf of Tonkin provocation in the following year of the major buildup by the administration in Johnson, as well as the initial teach-ins and vigils, the 1967 March on the Pentagon, and MLK Jr.'s speech at Riverside Beyond Silence against the war. In 1968, the My Lai Massacre. 1969, the discovery of the tiger cages, the nationwide moratorium, and the largest demonstration in the history of the United States at that time in November in Washington, D.C. In 1970, the invasion of Cambodia, the killing of 4 students at Kent State by the National Guard, 9 wounded. One of them was a high school classmate of mine. Followed a few weeks later in Jackson State, 2 people killed by community police. May Day in 1971 and the release of the Pentagon Papers, the atrocious carpet bombing of December 1972, the Peace Treaty of 1973, the cutoff of money, and the final end of the war in April of 1975. We have looked at all of those, and you're invited to look at them again. But tonight we're doing something different. Tonight we are looking at ourselves. We are looking at ourselves in order to examine, discuss, engage the impact that the anti-war movement had on the government, on the military, and on the policies that brought forth the war. What were our goals? What were our objectives, our strategies, our tactics? What worked well and why? What did not work well and why? What could or should we have done differently or maybe even better? I'll just give you a couple of look-ins, perspectives, before we move to our excellent panelists about the anti-war movement. One, the anti-war movement was made up of many sectors. There were students and then peace organizations, professors, churches, labor, environmentalists, etc. Some were militant and some were sectarian. What we're talking about mostly is the nonviolent mass movement that was less ideological, although we might all have agreed about being not only anti-war, but anti-imperialist. So it's that large mobilization across the country to which we are discussing tonight. Secondly, there's been some curious and serious commentary about how an anti-war movement that was so impactful, that caused such controversy and exposed the lies and deception by the Johnson administration that he could not run for office in 1968. And then when Nixon came to power and escalated the war, the discovery of Nixon breaking into Ellsberg's psychiatrist to try and expose him, as well as the Watergate scandal, both looking for what McGovern and company were doing about the war and how they were going to outflank him. And he had to resign in August of 1974. Some have asked why a mass movement like that deposed 2 consecutive presidents, did not have more political power and presence, maybe something like the Green Party in Germany. I ask you to consider that. And finally, let me say this, friends. Those of us who were in that movement, and many of you who are with us tonight and others who have followed it, became lifelong friends. It was one of the most inspirational and meaningful and incredible experiences of our lives. The people that I met in the anti-war movement are still the people I'm closest to after working in other organizations for another 30 years. So it's with a lot of admiration, a lot of appreciation, a lot of respect, even fondness, that we ask you to join us in looking at what we are looking at tonight. Remember, you can ask your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to come to those as much as possible. I will also remind you that there is a part 2 to this webinar that will be more of a discussion, which takes place in 3 days on Friday, March 28th at 5 p.m. New York time. So we'll try to answer your questions as they come, but also look forward to another opportunity. We have 5 excellent panelists, and I'm sure you will appreciate all of them. I'll introduce them one at a time as they speak. And our first is Robert Levering, whom you just met, who is going to talk initially about the anti-draft movement. Robert has been a lifelong social justice activist and a peace activist. He has been co-producer of 2 incredible films, The Boys Who Said No and The Movement and the Madmen, which exposes Nixon's interest in escalating the war, at which time he was challenged by the anti-war movement. And Robert, please, we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for getting us started.
Thank you, Terry. I'm going to talk briefly about something that's very clearly true, which is that the anti-draft movement actually helped to end the draft. And a lot of people today keep bemoaning, that they would like the draft, among other reasons, to be reinstated because they would like to, because they think that that would help to stop wars. Well, I want to say that the history of Vietnam is quite the opposite. The existence of the draft, which was restarted after World War II. It was during World War I and also during World War II, and then it was briefly stopped. But then when it did actually start again, it was part of the woodwork, and not that many people were drafted after Korea. But in 1964-65, when LBJ fraudulently started the war in Vietnam, he was able, because of the draft, to actually get 250,000 people into Vietnam within the first year of 1965, and then there were another 400,000 the next year, and then it was over 500,000 for the succeeding years until the war began to wind down. But anyway, the draft actually helped do the war, or helped him to do the war. Now, the draft also had a great vulnerability, and that is that it required the cooperation of people in order for it to succeed. And what happened was that there began to be an incredible movement against the draft. And I'm just going to say some of the numbers just so you get some kind of idea. The initial draft system, when the war started in earnest again in 1965, that a number of people, starting with a guy named David Miller, burned his draft card. So immediately Congress passed a law saying that if you burn your draft card, you're going to be, sent to prison. Anyway, and so David and others began to do that. The most public draft card burnings happened in 1967 when there was a big rally in New York City, and over 200 people burnt their draft cards. And then in 1968, when there's later in 67, when there was a big rally at the Pentagon, there were about 1,000 people that turned in their draft cards. And so Johnson decided he was going to crack down, and the next year actually indicted a bunch of people that he thought that would really stop it, Benjamin Spock, among others, and that actually backfired. And there was one backfire after another. And let me just give you some numbers. During the war years, Selective Service referred 210,000 men to the Justice Department for prosecution for refusing to participate in the draft, or, for one reason or another, didn't do it. But only 10% were indicted because the system was, couldn't handle it. And actually, according to one of the largest, and only 20,000 out of the 200,000 were indicted. Of that, only 4,000 went to prison. So it was, at the time, we all thought, if you violate the draft, that you were immediately going to go to jail. Well, it didn't happen. And the reason is that as one detailed study said, had draft law violators been prosecuted as vigorously as bank robbers, the federal prison system would have had to double its capacity at the height of the war. Estimated, in addition, 200,000 who violated the law, another 250,000 simply didn't register. Almost none were ever caught. Many intentionally flunked their physical exams. 2 of 3 failed to pass their physicals in mid-1970, and this would have included Donald Trump. And then there was another 30,000 fled to Canada or Sweden. So, and then nearly 800,000 filed for conscientious objector status during the war. And in 1972, more men received conscientious objector status than were inducted into the Army. And I'll just close with one statement to show you how the system had really collapsed. In the New York Magazine in June of 1970, it says, draft resistance in New York City has become so widespread and so sophisticated that the selective service system, cumbersome to begin with, seems barely capable of drafting anybody who doesn't want to be drafted. In Oakland, California, 53% of the 4,500 who were ordered for induction that year did not show up, and another 5% appeared but did refuse to be inducted. So instead of being a dependable system for funneling cannon fodder into the swamps and jungles of Vietnam, the draft had become a major liability for the war machine. Soon after Nixon became president, he decided the best way to blunt opposition to the war was to get rid of the draft. And finally, it was dismantled in 1973. So that's my presentation.
Thank you so very much for that eloquence and history walkthrough and the significance of people refusing to fight and endure whatever the consequences they were. David Wright is also somebody I've known for about 50 years. David has been involved in the GI movement against the war and has recently been professor at Notre Dame. He has a couple of books out, one on the lessons from the world's largest anti-war movement, and I think is currently writing some more. David, we welcome you to the Zoom room.
Thank you very much, Terry. What I want to do tonight is first say a couple words about my own story, how I became an anti-war activist inside the Army, and then talk more broadly about how the protest and resistance of GIs and vets influenced policy. So in 1968, graduated from Notre Dame. It was a very unfortunate time to be an available young man in America. As Robert was saying, the draft was at the peak, and many were being called up. 2 days after I got home from my graduation, I got my draft notice. In panic to try to avoid the infantry, I decided to sign up for the Army Band. I was a draft-induced volunteer, and I defended our country by playing my trumpet and baritone horn in the Army Band. My plan was to skate by and get on with my life, but my conscience couldn't allow it. Once I learned about what was actually happening in Vietnam, I was horrified and felt that I had to speak out. And there were many other GIs who were going through a similar experience. I was based at Fort Wadsworth in New York City, and several of us, and from there and Fort Dix and other bases around the country, put together and signed a petition signed by 1,365 active duty service members calling for an end to the war and for people to participate in the November '69 demonstration that Terry talked about. So we were very much involved in protests at all levels, even though we were active duty soldiers. Well, of course, we faced repression from our commanders. There was a big crackdown, and I was punitively transferred to Fort Bliss, Texas. Many others were transferred out. By the way, we did file a court case against that action by the Army. It became a pretty significant case, Cortright v. Reeser, and we actually won at the district court level. But I ended up at Fort Bliss, and it turned out Fort Bliss was a base with very widespread protests already underway. We had demonstrations in October of 1970 of more than 500 active duty soldiers. We had another one in the spring of '71 for what we called Armed Farces Day, where we had nearly 1,000 active duty soldiers participating. So you had a very broad anti-war movement inside the Army that began around '68 and early '69 and steadily grew through to 1970, 71, 72. One of the parts of the movement was the role of the veterans. Many soldiers who were in Vietnam were part of the anti-war movement, and they joined with the organization Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW. And they had one of the most significant anti-war actions of the entire movement in April 1971. 800 combat veterans descended on Washington for a week of protest. which culminated in a ceremony at the steps of the Capitol building when nearly 800 of these veterans, some in wheelchairs or in crutches, most of them with their military fatigues on, individually tossed their medals onto the steps of the Capitol to denounce the war. It was one of the most dramatic actions, as I mentioned, of the entire movement. It received front page television and newspaper coverage across the country, and it was a lead story for most of that week. The White House was panic-stricken by this. The veterans drove Nixon crazy. And H.R. Haldeman wrote in his memoir that the media coverage of the veterans was killing us, as he said. And the White House was pretty well being chopped up in the press. And this was a decisive moment when you could almost feel the public opinion of the American people turning more dramatically against the war, a time when veterans played a leading role. So that's some of the ways in which the movement had some impact on the political climate. There's also important about the direct resistance that existed within the military. Some soldiers like myself who were educated, university-based, we did protests, we published underground newspapers, dissented. But many soldiers engaged in direct resistance. They simply refused to participate. The desertion and absence without leave rates were at the highest level in U.S. militaries for more than 100 years. At one point in 1971, 17% of the people in the Army were AWOL or deserting, which amounted to more than 1 million person years of time of soldiers that was not available to the military during that time. There was also, in Vietnam especially, combat avoidance and refusal. We found that many soldiers by 70, 71 were not going out on regular combat missions in the usual way, but actually going out to try to avoid combat. And then there were many actual organized combat refusals. One Army scholar found that in 1970, in the 1st Division, there were 35 recorded combat refusals. That was one of 7 divisions that were in Nam at that time. So you do the math and you can see that easily hundreds of recorded combat refusals occurred during the war. It's hard to imagine how the military could carry on operations given those conditions. Worst of all was the horrifying phenomenon of fragging, where many hundreds of soldiers were attacked by fragmentation grenades. Usually they were by lower enlisted soldiers against officers and NGOs. And you really had a situation where the Army is starting to fall apart. It's no longer really functioning in an effective way. And this becomes relevant in terms of the decision-making at the White House. Those who were in charge of the armed forces at that time, which is Defense Secretary Melvin Laird and Senior Army Commander in Vietnam, Creighton Abrams, were deeply worried. Laird was an advocate for withdrawing troops very early on in the administration, as Rusty identifies in her book. But as he went back to Vietnam and surveyed the troops several times, he was increasingly worried that the war was, quote, destroying the military. This is according to his biographer. And he saw his mission as no less than the salvation of the U.S. military. And senior officers who had been opposed to withdrawing more troops were now urging a quicker pullout. Creighton Abrams confided to an aide, "I need to get this Army home to save it." So it's clear to me in conclusion that the resistance, the refusal to fight, the dissent that was so widespread within the military clearly motivated those at the top of the military command and increasingly political leaders in Washington that the war had to end, the troops had to be withdrawn more quickly, in part to save the Army from complete self-destruction. Thank you.
David, thank you. I hope you don't mind me saying I hope you'll keep trumpeting your story and sharing it in your writing and presentation. That's a lot of incredible information from inside the military that I don't think is as appreciated as much as it should be. Thank you very much. Rusty Eisenberg is a professor of history at Hofstra. She's written an incredible book that you're all encouraged to take a look at, Fire and Rain, and she's active in Historians for Peace and Democracy. And Rusty, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. In thinking about tonight, I'm very mindful of the context in which we're here, right? This is not that we all lived happily ever after in the military, put flowers in the guns, and then they went home and nothing bad's ever happened, right? It's horrible what's happening. And, as we're watching the U.S. facilitated massacre of Palestinians, for those of us who are old enough to remember, it actually brings back some familiar emotions. The sheer horror that our government was the cause of such suffering, especially of civilians, that you pick up the paper sometimes, it's just dread about what, other miserable thing had happened. And also the sense of urgency about changing the policy. But that sense of urgency for many people, and I think this is true of me, all of this was accompanied by a sense that nothing was working. That no matter how many people came out for a march, no matter how many events, no matter how much militancy was displayed, the policy wasn't getting any better. A very pervasive feeling. In subsequent decades, that sense of futility has actually been amplified by historians, including some from the left. They suggest that nothing the anti-war movement did altered the policy in any significant way. If the Vietnam War finally ended, it was for altogether different reasons. And there are even historians who say that the activity of the anti-war movement extended the war. When I started my book on Nixon-Kissinger's national security policy, it was actually not my intention to study the peace movement and its effects in any serious way. However, after decades of reading documents and listening to tapes, and if you spent years listening to them, something happens to your brain, it became increasingly obvious that the impact on the Nixon administration of the peace movement was substantial. When the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January of 1973, Nixon explained to the American people that all the conditions he had laid down had been met, that's a quote. And after extraordinary effort, the United States had truly achieved peace with honor. He assured Americans that this settlement meets the goals and has the full support of President Thieu and the government of the Republic of Vietnam, as well as that of our allies who are affected. He looked forward to a peace that lasts and a peace that heals. It will come as no surprise that nothing Nixon said that day was true. However, it became part of a more extended narrative peddled by the president and national security advisor Kissinger at the time and in subsequent years, and it was all equally deceptive, and we could come back to that. The declassified records suggest a very different story, lacking in honor or humanity. In truth, the Paris Accords were imposed on the South Vietnamese government, which despised its provisions from the outset. Actually, Thieu, when he saw them, began weeping when he saw them. Its content bore slight resemblance, but this peace agreement bore slight resemblance to the priorities that the Nixon administration had set from the very beginning. And furthermore, none of the participants seriously believed the result would be peace in Vietnam. And that includes Nixon and Kissinger. What this meant in real terms, this peace agreement, was that the U.S. could extricate its remaining troops in some face-saving way, get the prisoners home before fighting resumed between North and South. And that was also anticipated, as was a victory by North Vietnam. So that raises the question, why, after such an immense expenditure of lives, money, international credibility, did the Nixon administration make an agreement that was truly at odds with its initial goals? The answer, I think, is threefold. One is the weakness of South Vietnam, that no matter how much money, how big an army we bet, that the army was ineffective and disappointing. So that's part of the answer. Another part of the answer, of course, is the dedication and zeal of their North Vietnamese adversaries. And what is most overlooked by historians, the role of the peace movement in forcing a settlement on the administration. So in what respects did the anti-war movement influence the outcome? And I'm leaving out the important discussion that David Cortright just introduced about the role of the military. So if we ask that question of what was the impact, some of that impact was actually direct and immediate. Robert's documentary, The Movement and the Madmen, tells a very important story about how the October 1969 moratorium peace campaign forced the Nixon administration to scrap its plans for dramatic escalation of violence in both North and South Vietnam. You know, in that documentary, I think Daniel Ellsberg conjectures that there could have been a nuclear weapon used. I actually don't agree with that, but I think in every other respect, the point was made very effectively, which is that they really did have a plan to escalate, and they really did have to scrap it because the moratorium made that impossible. But taking a longer view, the most important effect of the anti-war movement was that it forced the Nixon administration to bring the troops home. By June 1972, the numbers had gone from 550,000 to about 30,000, almost none of whom were combat troops. Within the anti-war movement, when these things were happening, there was a tendency to dismiss the fact that this was happening. It was a trick, people said, a way to divert American attention while Nixon was escalating an air war in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam itself. Anyway, it was immoral. All he was doing was changing the color of the corpses. I think we were wrong. In reality, the continued removal of the troops, which Kissinger and the U.S. military bitterly opposed, and Nixon disliked doing, was very consequential because it meant that over time, the U.S. could no longer fight a ground war. And since it had become increasingly apparent that the army of South Vietnam was unable to function adequately on its own, the removal of American troops did not bode well for the future. So why did they remove the troops? There's a general answer and a specific one. The general answer is that the peace movement had created an atmosphere in the country in which Nixon needed to continuously demonstrate to the public that he was taking real steps to end the war, and troop removal was the proof. The narrower answer was opposition in Congress. In the corner of the peace movement that I inhabited, everyone was disgusted with Congress all the time. Year after year, anti-war resolutions were introduced, eloquent speeches were made, and inevitably, these resolutions were voted down, and more money was appropriated. But there was another side to this, which was the ongoing belief in the White House that if they did not remove the troops, some of those resolutions were going to pass. In other words, the potential of unfavorable congressional action was forcing a change in administration policy. Nixon had a phrase for this, as she said from time to time, we're one step ahead of the sheriff. On election day, 1972, the big news for most of us was that Nixon had won an overwhelming victory, which was astonishing. Less notice was that the congressional elections were different. More anti-war senators had been elected, increasing the likelihood that a congressional cutoff would likely occur. And in fact, in November, several of Nixon's allies, Senator Towers, Stennis, maybe Ford, went up to the White House and they said in January, when the new Congress came in, there will be no money to pay for the war anymore. So while many activists disdained electoral work, at least by then, others had continued with valuable results. And I want to just sneak in a quick thing about the McGovern campaign, which I think, again, was very, very disappointed. It was easy to think it was a waste of everybody's time. It wasn't. Because McGovern's candidacy did something extremely important, which is he consolidated the Democratic Party in Congress against the war. And all these people who wanted to run against him in primaries all became doves. Humphrey, you name it. These people had all switched. So McGovern actually made a contribution, even though it didn't feel like that at all on election night. In thinking about the role of the anti-war movement during this time, I want to offer one observation, which may be greeted with skepticism. The peace movement made Nixon hate the Vietnam War. He felt it was ruining his presidency. Constantly besieged by demonstrators, he wanted them to go away. Unlike Donald Trump, Richard Nixon hoped to be seen as an exemplary president, somebody who had achieved great things that made the world a better place. And this never-ending war with its noisy demonstrators and constant recriminations stood in the way. In this respect, it was different from Kissinger, who was not especially responsive to public opinion and who, left to his own devices, might have blocked troop withdrawals and hold out for a more favorable deal. But Kissinger was not, after all, a politician. As Nixon wearily said in December 1972, this war has got to stop. I mean, that's all there is to it. We cannot go along with this dreary business of hanging on for another 4 years. It's too long. It's too long. I mean it. With no truce left and Congress preparing to cut off the money, the president had no choice but to end the war. In all of this, the peace movement played a very large role. Yet a certain realism is appropriate. As we look back on this story, we also need to recognize that this Vietnam War went on for a very long time, with immense suffering to millions of people, Vietnamese, Laotians, Cambodians, our own soldiers. So you can't look back at this time without wishing we'd been more effective sooner, and wondering if our tactics had been different, could we have accomplished more faster? How does any of this history pertain to the challenging present? Mass movements make a difference, and much of the time you don't know if you are succeeding, so you try to do the right thing and enlist others to come along, and you don't give up. Throughout the Vietnam years, there were endless arguments about what tactics were the right ones. One conclusion that emerged from my research is that many tactics were the right one, that many approaches can work. Not helpful, perhaps, were the angry confrontations that disrespected fellow Americans and which were used by the administration. But when your country's leadership is committing great crimes, as we see today in Gaza, there's no alternative but to organize. And finally, just quick observation, which is how many of the people from the anti-war movement back then, right, are active today and tonight, working in every way possible to try to stop the carnage in Gaza and doing anything that we can do to get this thing to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Rusty. And even though I've read your book and have heard a couple times such positive assessment of the anti-war movement, I can still listen to it again and again. Thank you so very much.
Sure.
Friends, we had a lot of discussion about how we were going to plan and approach this discussion about looking at ourselves and commemorating the 10 years of teach-ins that we've done in the last 10 years. But we have two very unique panelists tonight, which I'm so glad they're here. The uniqueness is that they were both inside the government, both inside the White Houses of Johnson and Nixon, and they have really insightful comments to make. The first is Morton Halperin, who was in both the Johnson and the Nixon administrations, has written a book on the lessons Nixon learned, and he also resigned because of his opposition to the war in 1970, and has been interviewed in a lot of places and has some really valuable information. And Mort, if you would be willing to share that with us, we're all looking forward to it.
I think he's muted.
Mort, you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Please start again.
So I want to thank you very much, the organizers, for including me in this discussion. I am probably the only person on the discussion who was inside the Pentagon the day of the march on the Pentagon, rather than outside the Pentagon, working as it was to try to find a way to bring the CIA into the opposition to the war, which existed mainly, strangely enough, inside the Pentagon, in the civilian parts of the Pentagon. I agree with what's been said before, but let me present my own take on it, what the difference the anti-war movement made and what difference it did not make. It obviously did not end the war anytime quickly. It did play a role, I think, at the end, which I'll come back to. But in the Johnson administration, the fight was about expanding troop deployments. And the military were pressing for expanding troop deployments, but so were the civilians in the Johnson administration, because they wanted to expand the war to North Vietnam. Their goal was to get Johnson's permission to invade North Vietnam. And it was the anti-war movement that made that impossible, which led Johnson to turn down, you'll remember the 206,000 requests from Westmoreland, which Johnson turned down, I think, entirely because of the peace movement. Johnson did not believe in the Vietnam War. One of the differences, I think, important differences between Nixon and Johnson is that Nixon thought winning the war was important to American security. He came to understand that it could not ultimately be won, but he thought it was important to win. Johnson, I think, thought losing the war would lose him the presidency. He did not think the war itself was any threat to losing the war was any threat to American security. But he was playing with it by giving the military as much force as they wanted to, as slowly as he could, so as to have less impact on the Great Society programs. But the peace movement made it impossible for him to continue the escalation of the ground war. Nixon, as has already been suggested, was confronted with a situation in which he did not want to start pulling the troops out. Nixon and Kissinger were confronted with cabinet officers, the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, who were determined to start withdrawing the troops to save the morale, to save the integrity of the military, and because they didn't believe in the war. Nixon fought that, and again, the peace movement played a role in forcing him to stop the troop movements, but did not prevent him from escalating the war in various ways. He bombed Cambodia, he invaded Cambodia. He did ultimately the Christmas bombing of North Vietnam. But in the end, I think what did end the war was Watergate. And this is a subject that Dan Ellsberg and I discussed endlessly. And my last conversation with him, he wanted once again to discuss, did the Pentagon Papers end the war? What role did the Pentagon Papers end the war? And I'll just end with a little report on that. Dan believed, as I did, that the release of the Pentagon Papers and the content of the Pentagon Papers played a very small role in ending the war. The way the Pentagon Papers ended up playing a critical role is that Nixon was fearful that Ellsberg had papers from the Nixon administration and was going to make them public. And he wanted to discredit Ellsberg. And discrediting Ellsberg led to the plumbers, and from the plumbers to the attack on Ellsberg's psychiatrist, and then to Watergate. And it was then that the Congress had the strength and the will to end the war. And that was, I think, the critical connection. Let me end with that, and thank you again for inviting me in.
Thank you for coming and for accepting our invitation, and for the very illuminating information from inside, if you will. We're really glad you could do that. And our last panelist is Michael Koncewicz. And I'm sorry I made a mistake. I had thought that Michael was in the Nixon administration. I was wrong about that. He was in the Nixon Library and Museum, where he got to know and work closely with Nixon and his cohorts. He's a political historian. One of his books is about Republicans who stood up against the abuse of power. They said no to Nixon. And interesting enough, Michael is working on, and has been for 3 years, and will be doing so for 2 more years, on the sort of somewhat authorized biography of Tom Hayden. So, Michael, I apologize for the error, and I hope I'm right when I say you were in the Nixon Library.
Thank you, Terry. Oh, another correction. I worked at the Nixon Library, but that was from 2010 to 2014. I once met Ed Nixon, Richard Nixon's younger brother, but never met Richard Nixon himself. Ed Nixon is, I think, 15 years younger. No, it's okay. But thank you for the kind introduction. I want to thank the entire Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's an honor to be a part of this discussion. Especially since I've watched most of the panels that have been posted online over the last several years. I just want to say that this series is a treasure, and as a scholar of the Vietnam era, I'm extremely grateful for it. So thank you for all your work. I'm here to talk about Tom Hayden, but not just Tom Hayden, what he represented, and what's relevant for this discussion. The Tom Hayden of 1968 was repeatedly chased by police officers through the streets of Chicago during the week in the DNC. To avoid a third arrest, the then 28-year-old organizer donned a fake beard, sunglasses, and at times a football helmet. One reporter, this was a New York Times reporter who tagged along with him, described the SDS co-founder as a junior-sized Fidel Castro. That's in August of 1968. 6 years later, senators were meeting with the same Tom Hayden on Capitol Hill. Together with his then wife, Jane Fonda, he was helping to lead a lobbying effort to fully end the Vietnam War. On behalf of the Indochina Peace Campaign, he held anti-war teach-ins inside the Capitol, a moment that demonstrated just how far the movement had come. Tom Hayden, as many on the call know, was an exceptional figure in many ways, but what's more important for this discussion is focusing on how he was representative of the broader anti-war movement that won meaningful political power by the mid-1970s. Examining how Hayden went from being on trial to infiltrating the mainstream offers up a valuable case study on the anti-war movement's tactics, strategy, and even its past and now, current assessment of itself and its legacy. As others have already pointed out, his life is a reminder of the powerful impact of social movements and the unexpected political openings where activists can alter history. By the end of the 1960s, violence overseas greatly diminished the chances for pragmatic opposition at home. Hayden was one of many idealists who gave up on reforming their government. By 1968, he often embraced the rhetoric and at times the tactics of those who wanted to, quote unquote, bring the war home. He was especially disillusioned by the prospects of engaging with mainstream politics following his 2 trips to Vietnam in 1965 and 1967, where he witnessed the horrific impacts of U.S. bombs. Domestically, the assassinations and protests of 1968 further fed his rage at the establishment. He had no idea at the time that the Nixon White House was obsessed with the movement's growing influence. The president, as others have pointed out, closely monitored the movement. He monitored each of the major demonstrations, was regularly briefed on sectarian splits. You'd be surprised how much he knew about different sectarian groups within the anti-war movement, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised. He sought to cut federal funding to MIT to punish anti-war students and faculty, and tried to find ways to get rid of civil servants who he felt were too sympathetic to the movement. He wasn't just watching football, as his aides often told the press. As part of the Chicago 8, Tom Hayden was sentenced by the infamous Judge Julius Hoffman to 5 years in prison in February 1970 for a conspiracy to riot. At that time, in his writings, Hayden called for liberated zones and warned the American public of an impending civil war. In an essay for the New York Times, he wrote, "The alternative to peaceful change is not intimidation, submission, and conformity. The alternative to a peaceful transition is sharper confrontation, leading into a prolonged civil war." The piece, remember this is in the New York Times, listed Tom Hayden as a defendant in the Chicago conspiracy trial and as a member of the Red Family, a radical collective in Berkeley that he helped form. What's relevant about Hayden's time in Berkeley for this discussion is that it was a period where he took a step back away from organizing against the war at a national level. Instead of participating in events like May Day or any other major demonstration against the war, he focused on local work in Berkeley. Exhausted and tied up in the appeals court, Hayden had no interest in working with any of the major anti-war organizations throughout most of 1970 and 1971. His exhaustion reflected the growing sense of futility that infected parts of the anti-war left, but of course, others persisted. Berkeley offered a break from national organizing. For Tom, it was a radical youth community that he dreamt could be at the forefront of a revolution. When he was kicked out of his collective and moved to Los Angeles, those dreams died. And it was there that he re-embraced the anti-war movement. First, through teaching college students in Los Angeles at Immaculate Heart, where he developed a new slideshow about the history of Vietnam. With Jane Fonda, he established a new ambitious project, the Indochina Peace Campaign, which initially started as a public education tour in 1972. They visited state fairs, union halls, churches, and campuses, where they were regularly greeted by thousands of people as part of an effort to rebuild a more united nationwide movement to counter Richard Nixon's handling of the final stages of the war. Hayden knew it was important to identify meaningful victories in this moment for the movement. When Nixon announced that the United States would remove all of its troops from Vietnam in January 1973, Hayden pushed organizers to take ownership of their victory. He wrote, "It is our victory, ours and Vietnam's, and not Richard Nixon's. Great changes in public opinion have occurred because of our movement." Hayden's move toward more conventional tactics included linking up with a network of activists who had for years been focused on lobbying Congress. Like many on the New Left, Hayden was initially skeptical of lobbying or any sort of conventional tactic, but the unfolding Watergate scandal convinced him there was an opening for the anti-war movement. That same month, an appeals court overturned Hayden's conviction as a part of the Chicago 8. And so the same month that happened, IPC formalized their support of congressional lobbying at a conference in Germantown, Ohio. A free man, Hayden now sought to capitalize on what he referred to as the Watergate opportunity. The time was right to pressure Congress to cut funding to South Vietnam and stop Nixon from taking further military action against the Vietnamese people. IPC helped unite much of the anti-war movement and helped solidify its power in D.C. Richard Nixon's request for more military aid was defeated in the House in April 1974 by a 177 to 154 vote. The Senate would do the same the following month. It was the first time that Congress had opposed a request for military aid in Vietnam since 1964. In his memoir, Tom wrote that the vote was a turning point for me in working through the system. He recalled walking out on a, quote, starry Washington night after the first legislative victory in May and, quote, thanking the heavens for our trust in the process. The system worked for the movement in 1974, but only through persistent grassroots pressure that helped an authoritarian president destroy himself. Hayden recognized this later in his life, and we should keep this lesson in mind when both evaluating the legacy of past social movements along with evaluating the potential impact of today's anti-war activists. At one IPC event in the fall of 1973, Hayden told the audience that the recent revelations of the Watergate scandal showed the world that Nixon feared the movement. He said, "You may know the feeling of being useless. You never knew the president would be watching you behind curtains." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I'm really glad you're working on the Hayden biography, and I'm sure it'll be as eloquent and as fascinating as what you've just said. I hope our viewers will all appreciate the panelists. I'm going to ask each one of you a question relative to your presentation. And then, John, if you want to find a question or two among those that are coming in, I'll turn to you after the quick round of these 5 questions. And try, please, to keep your answers brief if you don't mind. So, Robert, in terms of the anti-draft movement, I would like you to talk a little bit about the significance of Muhammad Ali, his Muslim faith, and how that led him to resist. And comment, too, on the diversity and inclusivity of the anti-war movement in terms of race, knowing that a lot of civil rights organizers moved over into starting the peace movement in the early 60s. What do you have to say about that, please?
Well, Muhammad Ali, it mostly got him vilified. I'm not sure it didn't actually. It changed the complexion of the idea of who was actually resisting the war, but he was definitely vilified, and it really did. The other question, it's important, and one of the things that most people don't know is the first organized group to advocate draft resistance was SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Organizing Committee. It's very interesting. In 1965, they actually did that, and that's a terrific. It's a fact that most people don't know. And the other thing that you did allude to, which is that a very large percent of the initial organizers of the anti-war movement, including Tom Hayden, were actually people who were veterans of the civil rights movement. And that's also not mentioned. And I noticed that David Hawk is on our call, and he was one, and he mentioned that in what we had in our movie.
Hey, Robert, thank you. David, let me ask, it might be a bit provocative, and as important as the resistance was in the military, I want to talk about veterans who came back, who were involved in fighting, weren't against the war, didn't join VVAW. What did or what did not the peace movement do with those who were scarred and emotionally wounded and traumatized? There are myths about how the anti-war movement spit on veterans who returned home. Can you rearrange that so we understand better more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. That's a really important point. The myth about spitting on troops, it's still out there and people talk about it all the time. There is no contemporary documentation of that actually happening. There have been scholarship published on that. When I was an active duty soldier at military bases and fighting against the war, the civilian anti-war movement was a tremendous source of support. When we tried to sue the Army, we had no attorneys. We didn't know anything about the law. There was a law firm in New York that volunteered to help us and carried through that case. There were Tom Hayden and others joined the Support Our Soldiers movement in '68 to open coffee houses outside major military bases to provide support for soldiers who are beginning to speak out. In really difficult right-wing communities where these military bases are located, it was some of those coffee shops were attacked, some were hit with rifle fire and the like, but anti-war activists, put themselves on the line to help soldiers to speak out. So really that's entirely a myth, and especially the anti-war movement. Undoubtedly, it's full documented that the anti-war movement welcomed troops, soldiers, and veterans into the movements. I was invited to be on the national coalitions. I didn't know anybody in these groups, but this was their gesture of support toward active duty service members and to many veterans as well.
Thank you very much. Rusty, you're a historian. It's almost unbelievable. Maybe this is overgeneralizing, but most of us feel that the Vietnam War, the American war in Indochina, is not taught in high schools, is not taught in colleges, and maybe in only a few places for which what we've been doing for the last 10 years may be helpful. I want to ask you why. Is it because the United States was vanquished and totally humiliated and defeated? Was it because the tactics that the United States military used, such as free fire zones and napalm and bombing dikes and anti-personnel weapons? Or was it third, perhaps it was the largest peace movement in the history of the country against its own government? Can you explain why this is missing in the curriculum in high school and universities?
Well, it's not really missing in the universities, I think, but it is missing in high schools. I want to make a slightly different point and then swing back, which is, because I offered courses on Vietnam, for decades, and in different places. And I would say one thing, particularly in the places where I've taught, especially at Hofstra University, is that those courses used to be very well enrolled, and very typically because about half the students had fathers who had been in Vietnam. And it was very common for kids to say, my father clams up. And I'm thinking, if I'm in this class, maybe this will open up a line of communication. And so in a way, that group of young people was really, an important constituency. It would be kind of, some glib to say, oh, well, it's not taught because it's a bad story. But sadly enough, I don't think that's why. I think it's the way that the curriculum is set up in high school, that they never get to anything. They don't even get to the end of World War II. So that's a different thing. I don't see it as a big problem in the universities. There's been a lot of scholarship and teaching about that. It's fading now, but I think it was there. It is just astonishing how little my students know about American history after 1945. And, this is not what you're asking me about, but, given what's happening right now to our democracy, such as it is, it's astonishing to me that my students, how little they know about the government, that they, the separation of powers, or what the Constitution is about. I mean, it's actually, startling. I mean, this failure is legion, except, very elite high schools and, private schools and so forth. So those students have a much better education. But coming out of the public school system, I think it's a terrible failure. And it really covers many issues that I don't actually think it's because it's bad news, that in and of itself.
I don't mean this to be too provocative, but I hope you'll be able to speak freely. So within the anti-war movement, there was a lot of vilification and contempt for both Johnson and Nixon. It's like, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And Nixon, whose middle letter looks so much like a swastika and filthy, dirty politician. What was some of the language, or what were some of the things said within the government about the anti-war movement? How did you sort of hear people talk about it? And what did the government do to try and really repress the anti-war movement?
Well, I think, you know,
No,
there's probably
Rusty, Carolyn, that's just for Mort.
uh, for Mark.
I'm sorry, Rusty. This is for
No,
Mort.
it's okay. I'm fine.
Um,
Happy.
I'm sorry if I said Carolyn. I meant Morton.
Go ahead.
Truth is, I was not exposed to that at all. If there were discussions about how to deal with the anti-war movement, I was not a party to them. I think there was a concern about how important it was becoming and the impact that it was having on support for the war. But I don't think there was there was disdain. I think people understood that they were upset about being drafted in particular. And I think Nixon's insight was, which I think was correct, that an important part of this for some portion of the anti-war movement was in fact the draft.
All right, thank you. And finally, I'll ask Michael a question, and then John, if you want to set up a question of your own or from the chat room, that'd be fine. Michael, this may not be the most appropriate question, but pardon me if it isn't. In February of this year, a group of lawyers, a newly formed organization, filed an Article 15 with the International Criminal Court, asking for an investigation and charges of war crimes to Biden, Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin. This is the first time that's happened in the United States and for people who are no longer in office. Looking back at the 60s and the 70s, how would you answer this question? Should Johnson, McNamara, Nixon, and Kissinger should have been investigated for war crimes and charged with war crimes?
Yes.
Say more.
I'm sorry for the boring answer, but yes. I mean, and I think for no other reason, it would establish some sort of historical precedent. There's obviously, as we're seeing today, there's real limitations in terms of what that accomplishes when it comes to politics. But I do believe it has some value.
Let me remind everybody who is online with us right now that we will have some more questions and discussion on Friday at 5 o'clock, to which you're all welcome. But we do have a little more time here. And John, let me look to you to see if you want to raise a question from the audience or have one of your own.
Okay, I want to actually start out with a question that we got by email from Joe Ergo, who I don't see on tonight. So he may be one of about half the people who register aren't able to make it, but then they watch the video, which should be on YouTube by tomorrow. But Joe's question was, what was the impact of the anti-war movement on people in Vietnam? The population, combatants, obviously there were populations and combatants on both sides, but we I just put on the screen a friend of mine who is a Fulbright student at American University, which is symbolic of many things, including the fact that, like a lot of other programs supported by the U.S. government, the Fulbright money has now stopped. So he's moving into his department head's home, and it's worth stating that people have to recognize that there are many consequences of the noises coming out of Washington. But I've asked Hai if he could say a little bit about the reaction in Vietnam. So if you could unmute yourself and for a couple of minutes, give people a bit of that. And I'd also remind everyone, as Terry said, that on Friday afternoon, we'll have a much more open format and try to divvy up the time so everybody gets a chance to talk. Hi.
Thank you very much, John, and good evening, everyone. I'm a senior lecturer from universities in Vietnam, and as John said, I'm a Fulbright visiting scholar in residence at American University. So thank you, John. Thank you, the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, for organizing this very significant webinar on, this year, the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. So I was born right after the war. So I myself, didn't have the experience like many of you. I was not involved in, the war. I have no, concepts of the war. But what I know about the war is through the materials, through my research. So what I'm sharing with you is the views from Vietnamese historians and how they saw and recognized the importance of the anti-war movements in the U.S., particularly for the fightings led by the Communist Party of Vietnam that led to the end of the war in 1975. So for Vietnam, the anti-war movements was very significant, and it has a huge impact on the developments of the war in Vietnam. So for Vietnamese people, they saw the movement as a force of progressive mankind. It consolidated the perception of Vietnamese people that the wars they are fighting against the Americans is a just war, and it of course is a motivation for Vietnam's for the Vietnamese troops led by the Communist Party of Vietnam to fight for the liberation of the country. And more importantly, as we all know that during the end of the 1960s and early 1970, there was a negotiation between factions and parties involved in the war. So the anti-war movements apparently created a pressure on the Nixon administrations and also the negotiators on the U.S. side, and we all know that it all led to the signing of the Paris Agreements on January 27, 1973. So on the other side, of course, as John said, the anti-war movement also have the impact on American soldiers in Vietnam too. Say, for instance, according to Vietnamese materials, in 1972, for instance, 40 out of 140 American soldiers in Phu Bai, which is part of the central part of province in Vietnam, denied to get involved in the fighting. Or in 1971, for instance, as we all know, that there's a report by the Department of Defense saying that 1,000 American soldiers stationed in Vietnam were absent in their duty briefings. So apparently, for that kind of impact, and also the ongoing anti-war movements in Vietnam, in the eyes of Vietnamese people, has a huge impact. And in fact, Vietnam used and took it as a kind of weapons. Now, intangible weapons, we can say, or spiritual weapons, in order for them to, fight against the Americans. So, in fact, Vietnamese always say, well, in order to win the war, they mobilized, own strengths, including the support of Americans, to support them, to help them in order to win the war. So as I said, I belong to the generation born after the war, but maybe many people might not agree what I have said, but this is what Vietnamese people saw the importance of the anti-war movements.
Thank you. Thank you.
John, could I just make a comment?
Sure.
Just quickly. Thank you, Hai. And that spirit that the Vietnamese leadership had of understanding the need for solidarity with Americans opposed to the war. We witnessed that when we were there. John, you were there in 2018 on the 50th anniversary of My Lai. And there was this extraordinary exchange between American anti-war veterans and Vietnamese anti-war veterans, and in which all of us could, the combat veterans especially, not myself, could share with their colleagues what it was like. And the extraordinary fact that the Vietnamese had essentially defeated the American military, and yet they had the spirit of reconciliation and were welcoming us back and trying to build for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I was amazed by the returns of the son of the former Secretary of Defense. He just recently published a book. I think this is amazing. It's really a significant size of reconciliation, as David said. So yeah.
Yep.
That's
David, have you read his book yet? This is McNamara's son's book.
Yeah, I read it.
You have read it?
Yeah.
Do you think it's something people should?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of course, is about his relationship with his dad, but the war is constantly woven in, and it's a really moving personal saga. It's just as a narrative of one's relationship to a very powerful father who was often absent. So.
I want to second that. I think it's very much worth reading.
Good. What is his first name? I can't.
Craig.
Craig. So if you just go to your local bookstore or to the behemoth Amazon, Craig McNamara, you can find it. I had one question, a generalized question for all of you in a way, which is if you were redoing something about the period or the sector that you're talking about, what would be done differently? I mean, what in a sense are the negative lessons of our experience that might be useful for people now struggling around issues of Ukraine or Gaza or other problems that you would say as an elder, well, this is what we really screwed up on, and you should do it better. Do you have any thoughts, Robert, from the anti-draft movement or others?
Well, I think Rusty said it very beautifully at the very end. Sort of like almost everything is worth doing. I mean, resist, and that you don't know what impact they are. I do think that if it's not nonviolent, it backfires. Or as she put it, if you things that are divisive towards other Americans, that's always, that's going to backfire. Keep the focus on what we're really opposed to or what we really want to see. So that's fine.
Anybody else want to pick up on that? Terry, do you have some thoughts yourself on that? Because you were involved in many stages from the beginning to the end.
Well, certainly the maturing of the peace movement and its development, I think, is something that can be seen in some stages. And what I appreciated a lot was sort of the witness of the Catholic left and how it inspired a lot of people in the religious communities. And what was critical, I would say, would be sort of the tension between men and women in the anti-war movement and the sexism that was, I think, prevalent, that caused for, a weakening of our strength and power. And for example, and one thing here that I think we could have done a little more about and didn't have time to mention was just how we learned about corporations and the military-industrial complex. It's Eisenhower who says that at the end of his presidency, and therefore kind of as a footnote, I'm sorry I say this about McNamara, he kind of says he didn't believe in the war after he, helped fight the war. There's a lot that I think we could have done and should have done. There were campaigns against Dow for napalm and Honeywell for anti-personnel weapons. but I think that could have been stronger as well. Yeah. John, let me just add here that maybe somewhat humorously, if you don't mind, just a little, and that was the intimacy that we all experienced with during this time, and there must have been a lot of children who came out of the anti-war movement, and some way I wish we could celebrate them. I'm somewhat tempted to ask Robert whether or not the slogan "Girls who will say yes to the boys who say no," did that enhance the anti-draft movement? I would like to think so, but I'm not so sure. But I hope all of us have some appreciation for what happened during those 10 years, and the honor and the witness and the working together and the discovery of ourselves, and sort of how we learned a lot about who we are and what we became, and how we learned a lot about our country. I just want to remind everybody, as we're coming to a close, that we have more questions, and there are a lot of good ones in the Q&A, and I appreciate many of them for our next time on Friday. But just two things: the footprint that the United States left in Vietnam didn't get lifted when the war ended in 1975, and it's been somewhat of a foot on their neck for a long time with the boycott and a couple other things. But there are two major problems still today, and one is the dioxins and the impact of Agent Orange. That's actually my name for the person who occupies the White House right now. I think we should rename the Trump administration Agent Orange. And please go to Susan Hammond's organization, War Legacies, to find out how you can be helpful and supportive to projects, especially since USAID is cutting back, that can help alleviate and support people even in the fourth generation of exposure to Agent Orange. And the other is unexploded ordnances and landmines, and another organization there that's run by Chuck Searcy called Project Renew. I also would encourage you to look at those as way to be supportive of increasing the peace and reconciliation between the United States and the people of Vietnam. John, I think I'll stop there and leave you to say
All
whatever
right.
you think. Yeah.
So let me pick up a couple of the other questions, because it gets us into a little bit different area, which is Carol Jensen asked about the long-term effects of local anti-war organizing, of the grassroots. And then somebody asked about Women's Strike for Peace and its impact. And you could also say Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which were older peace movement organizations that had a new existence during the Vietnam War and contributed to it. So if anybody would like to touch on those particular aspects, local activity, religious institutions, and the two women's organizations, give you a chance to do that.
Oh, John, I might.
Yeah.
Rusty, you should go.
Well, I think it's very hard to parse that out, really. I mean, when you think about the movement as a whole, there were so many different events and strands in the movie. So in the movement, so I think Women's Strike for Peace was one of the things that was very positive. That became a vehicle for many women who had not participated to find a home and a useful role. And I think it was, extremely important in that way. I think, one thing that I'm struck with, which I know I keep wanting to bring us to the miserable present, but, what's interesting is that a lot of the local organizing that went on back then, you're still seeing it now. I mean, I was thinking before I came on this, this webinar last night, we had this meeting in Brooklyn with lots of folks, and it was different generations. And probably a half of them were the people who had been doing local organizing when they were in the Vietnam movement, as well as then other people and younger people that are coming in. I mean, I think that whole idea or approach of trying to build anti-war sentiment from the ground up and having yourself rooted in a community, I think the habits of organizing, they're certainly not adequate. But they're still with us, and of course we hope it's going to be even stronger given what we're up against right now.
Yeah, and I was going to say something very similar and second what Rusty is mentioning, that really the key is the power of grassroots mobilization. And especially when it's tied to an effective lobbying campaign, as Michael was saying with the Indochina Peace Campaign, very effectively mobilized people in the local districts of the members who we needed to get to vote on these measures to cut the funding to the war. And I'm writing something now in which I'm seeing that as one of the lessons of these movements for today. You know, with a completely solid Republican Congress, we're not going to get anywhere lobbying in the halls of Capitol Hill these days. But we have to build the base in the communities, and it's already happening in many communities, and then build that into a more sustained effort that is then coordinated with lobbying efforts where possible, but especially around electoral campaigns in the coming years.
Michael.
Really quickly, I think if there's room for growth for scholarship about the anti-war movement, it would be focusing on the organizations that actually reached smaller towns and suburbs across the country. And I think that's one of the more impressive things that the movement and the Madman does in that film. You see that the anti-war movement was not just Tom Hayden, it was not just Abby Hoffman, it was not just occurring in Berkeley, Madison, and New York City. I think we need to have more descriptions of what was transpiring across the country.
Yeah. Another film that I noticed the filmmaker has been watching this is The War at Home, which looks at the microcosm of Madison, Wisconsin, from the first Quaker vigils and lonely standing along the roadway with signs, and ends up goes through the confrontation, the militant confrontation of the students with local government and officials, and ends up with the tragedy of the bombing, the death in the bombing of the math building. So that's available online and as a good complement to the two films that have already been mentioned. We will post all of the questions and all of the chat on the page, the bios page, and I don't know whether I'll get it done before Friday afternoon for sure. So I encourage everybody first to come back on Friday, and as I say, we'll try and figure out a way to give everybody who comes at least 3 minutes to say what's most on their minds, and then that will again be online as a YouTube video. So this will be a two-part program that will add to the record. Mort, did you have anything more you wanted to say before we?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to participate and hope my comments were useful.
Yeah, I want to say personally that Mort was very important as the head of the ACLU office in Washington when we were trying to get Nguyen Wang into the United States to speak, a Harvard-educated economist who was refused entry, and then the Times ran an editorial, and Mort, as the ACLU person, was very helpful. And finally, when Wang came, it was a phenomenally effective trip in reaching Vietnamese Americans and the American business community and other parts of the mainstream that we had to get engaged in the issues of normalization. So there is a list of all of these webinars. You could spend the rest of the year watching them. And there are these 3 trips. The elders, which is mostly African Americans and Puerto Rican participants, will be in Vietnam for the anniversary. Veterans for Peace, Chuck Searcy and Paul Cox will have a group also in Ho Chi Minh City on April 30th, and they'll then be doing a trip around the country. We have a group that starts on the 15th in Hanoi and will go throughout the country and be in Ho Chi Minh City, and we can still include people in that trip. If you're interested, send me a note. So thank you very much, Terry, for conceiving this and pulling all the pieces together. We've taken advantage of Rusty's expertise and perspective several times over the last couple of years, and Bob has been an essential component in through the films and his work, his contribution in VPCC discussions to bringing back in the most effective way the experience that we all had some part of. And David has been the interpreter of the veterans' experience into this larger anti-war movement environment. So, and hi, it's good to have you with us, and I hope that we will see what you write from your experience in the U.S.
Can I just have a quick more comment, John? And
Sure.
sorry, yeah. Thank you, everyone. Now, as John said, I'm here to do researches on Vietnam and U.S. relations, and I'm investigating trust in the relationship between Vietnam and the U.S. So I think now, if I make your comments on the anti-war movements, I think it's very relevant to my research. Actually, it also linked to trust. Because as we often say, well, we have the war, but we have the war with government, not with the people. So the anti-war movements really, support really, create in the belief of Vietnamese people that, well, we still have American people supporting our cause, supporting our fighting. So it is really a source of trust in it that, make the Vietnamese people, make the Vietnamese government trust that we still have whatever. At the end of the day, we still have friends in America. We still have a good relationship with the United States. So that really, a source of trust. And I think I'm going to discuss that in my book too. Thank you. Thank you, John, again.
Thank you. That's an excellent conclusion. So take care, everybody. And again, Friday, and then on the 4th or 5th of April will be our next webinar on the Third Force, which was set up as by the Paris Agreement as a political way out of the conflict, and unfortunately did not succeed in doing that because of the hostility from the Saigon government and the United States. So if you can come back for that, you'll get another dimension of this story. In that case, it will be entirely Vietnamese and Vietnamese American speakers. So take care. And, I
Nice
should
to
say,
see everyone.
Frank Joyce has been on this audience. I don't know whether the elders group is also open to additional participation, and the Veterans for Peace group may well be too, but write to me and I can help you about both of those groups. So take care. Good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Terry.
Bye,
Thank you, Robert.
everyone.
Have a good night.